Havana Harbor in the U.S. went to war, the Spanish-American War. You know, all the officers happened to be off the main when the explosion happened. It's odd. You really see that in the Navy, that all the officers would be off the ship. The Lusitania was carrying munitions when it was sunk by German U-boats, not the U.S. into World War I. So, you know, we ought to be skeptical at this point. But with Iran, they combine this barrage of accusations with a demonization of the government so that, you know, people who otherwise might have their heads on straight just say, well, that's a crazy government. I mean, they're capable of anything. You know, I believe they do that, you know. So let's just look briefly at some of the major charges. Is Iran trying to develop a nuclear weapon? I think that was kind of answered. There's no evidence whatsoever. Iran signed this treaty back in the 60s. Almost every country has signed it. What it says is that if you have nuclear weapons, you're supposed to reduce them and work towards their total abolition. And if you don't have nuclear weapons, and you promise not to try to develop them, you have the right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful energy purposes. You have the right to develop it. And not only that, but the other countries that have signed the treaty are supposed to help you develop it. So under this international treaty that is the major non-proliferation treaty dealing with nuclear weapons, the United States is under the obligation to help Iran develop nuclear power plants. And yet, the U.S. says, yes, we recognize that right. However, we think you're using the development of nuclear power as a cover for developing nuclear weapons. And the worst offender in this is the Associated Press. It always refers to Iran's nuclear ambitions, Iran's nuclear program, you know, Iran's attempt to develop nuclear power, as if they're like it was the same thing, you know, nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Now, personally, I'm opposed to nuclear power. There's no way to get rid of the fuel. The fuel's going to be around forever. And, you know, if there's an earthquake, you're in a lot of trouble. And Iran is an earthquake-prone country. But France, which until, you know, Sarkozy was the most, you know, aggressive European country demanding Iran stop developing nuclear power, depends on nuclear power for 80% of its energy. I think it's 16% of the world's energy is produced by nuclear power. The United States, I mean, what right do they have to tell Iran they can't have, you know, but yet Iran, I was just reading a government book the other day that mentioned that Iran has been in trouble in the world because it has refused to convince the rest of the world that it's not developing nuclear weapons. It has refused to convince. Now, you know, they say, come in and inspect. You know, there's 20 sites that are open to the IAEA, anything that is remotely connected with nuclear weapons. But the UN agency says, no, we want to visit this military base. We think you're doing something there. So Iran has to figure, do we really want them to come in and nose around our military bases? Because that's what they did to Iraq. See? They sent CIA agents over with the UN inspection team. Scott Ritter was one of the inspectors, and he wrote a book about it. You know, he quit in protest. They were just collecting information. Not only that, the IAEA writes up reports. In some of the reports, they mentioned interviewing Iranian nuclear scientists. And 2 of them have been assassinated since the report came out. So 4 of them have been killed altogether in Tehran, drive-by shootings or shootings. That is, you know, pretty widely believed to be the work of Assad agents from Israel working in conjunction with U.S. intelligence. So Iran's in a position where it could give up its nuclear power program. It could just give it up. And so what? They've got a lot of oil. You know, they could survive without nuclear power. Except that oil is finite, and someday they'll run out. And the population is twice today what it was 30 years ago. They already have, you know, a certain number of blackouts in major cities because of you know, not having enough electricity to provide everyone. But also, Iran doesn't have the refinery capacity to refine its oil. It has to sell its crude oil on the world market and buy back refined oil. Now, why doesn't it just build a refinery plant? Because there's a there's sanctions against it. They can't buy the parts. They can't buy the material. They tried to start a wind plant, a wind power plant. And a Danish company was going to sell them the information, and the U.S. told them to sell to Iran, they can't sell to the United States. You know, so they couldn't do the project.
So this is a carrot and stick approach of Washington, correct?
To the other countries.
Right.
To the, with Iran as
so-called soft power of the U.S.
Yeah, right. Well, that's what the latest sanctions say.
Yeah.
If you deal with Iran, you can't deal with the United States. The U.S. is the biggest market in the world, and Iran is relatively small. So, you know.
But then if Iran gives up its civilian nuclear program, which even American intelligence agencies say that they don't believe Iran is developing or has any intention of transforming that into some kind of weapons-grade nuclear program, what will be the impact on the medical isotopes that they won't be able to use?
Yeah.
Well, just patients with it.
We'll get into one little technical thing, then we'll move, because that's important, and then we'll move on to some of the other issues. But nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons both use uranium. Uranium is a raw material in the ground that has to be refined, purified. So in order to do that, you set up these machines called centrifuges, and they spin. And they spin in a certain configuration, and it's a very tricky thing to get hundreds of them to spin just right, which is why most countries don't have nuclear power. Iran figured out how to do it. If you purify uranium to a 5% level of purity, that's what you use in a nuclear power plant. If you purify it to 95%, that's what you use in a nuclear weapon. And it's not a question of just cranking up the dial from 5 to 95. It's a different setup. Yeah, you need more centrifuges, they're configured differently, and it would be virtually impossible for Iran to set this up without the U.S. knowing about it. So Iran says, so how can we prove that we're not doing something that we're not doing? You know, like, you know, if Bentley says, Phil, you still beating Anna at night? And I say, no. And she says, prove it. And I say, well, you know, how do I do that? You know, and then you come to my house and you find a hammer and you go, you know, this is a dual use thing here. You might use it, you know, to put up a picture, but you could use it to hit Anna too. Right? I mean, you know, there's no way to prove you're not doing something that you're not doing. So they just say, you're doing it. Iran can develop uranium to 5% purity, and it's recently, in the last year, been able to reach 20%. Now that's important because under President Gerald Ford, a little three-person team went over to Iran to convince the Shah that he needed nuclear power. That team included Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, and someone else who was also famous after that. And they told the Shah, you know, oil is a finite resource, you're going to run out of it eventually, and we got companies like Westinghouse and General Electric that could help you build a power plant. So he signed a $3 billion contract, or a set of $3 billion contracts. And under the Atoms for Peace program, they built a nuclear reactor in Tehran University that is for medical purposes. It produces isotopes that are used in cancer treatments.
With the help of the American government.
Right, right. And they now, there's 180,000 cancer patients in Iran who depend on the isotopes from this reactor, which is running out of fuel. And that was what all the, you know, the arguments was about. Iran wanted to crank up and produce 20% enriched uranium. The U.S. said, no, you can't do that. And so that, you know, there's all kinds of different plans and things that were proposed every time they went to the settlement. The U.S. said, no, that's not good enough. And so Iran was kind of stuck. They went ahead and they got up to 20%. That's a ways from 95. But the U.S. said, see, we're getting closer. So they're kind of stuck. They can give up and give up really their right, their national sovereignty, give up their right to develop nuclear power and be humiliated before the West. But of course, but that's not the issue. The issue is that Iran has the third largest oil reserves, sells the second largest amount in the world, could control the Strait of Hormuz, which passes at least 20% of the world's oil. I keep reading these bourgeois newspapers, and one says 20 and one says 40, and you wonder how people keep their jobs if they can't figure out how much oil is going through the Strait of Hormuz. But it's a very narrow little strait, and the navigable part apparently is in Iranian territory. So the U.S. says, Iran's too dangerous. So Iran is caught between a rock and a hard place. Meanwhile, that's not the only charge being made against Iran. So let's move on to the crazy Ayatollahs, so-called, and their threats to destroy Israel because they supposedly hate Jewish people, and the president even denies the Holocaust. Iran has the second largest of Jewish people in its country than any other country in the Middle East except Israel. About 30,000 people. And they've lived there for 3,000 years. Since Cyrus, the head of the first Persian Empire, took over Babylon and liberated the Jews who were held as slaves, and brought them back to Jerusalem and raised money so they could rebuild the temple. But someone felt good enough about Cyrus, they decided to settle around Esfahan and now in Tehran. They're not Zionists. The Jews, they're not Zionists. They don't support Israel. And Israel tells them, if you emigrate, it's very embarrassing for Israel to have all these Iranian Jews who don't want to move to Israel. Say, they will give $5,000 to any Jewish family that moves to Israel. They'll give $10,000 to an Iranian family. And right-wing Christian evangelical groups will believe that the second coming can't come until all Jews return to Israel, at which point they'll all either die or become Christians. I'm not sure why the Israeli government thinks this is a good ally, but they will put up another $10,000. So an Iranian family can get $20,000 to move from a country targeted by U.S. imperialism to Israel, which has one of the highest standards of livings for Israelis in the world.
To bring about the end of the world.
Yeah.
So
it's not a big goal for a lot of people. Now, but didn't President Ahmadinejad say, we will wipe Israel off the map? No, he didn't. His translator said that. Ahmadinejad gave a talk at a conference on Zionism in Tehran, I think it was 2005. And he said, as the Imam has said, referring to Ayatollah Khomeini, this regime occupying Jerusalem will disappear from, I think it was the pages of history, or from history. And the translator, who was a government translator, translated as Israel will be wiped off the map. And that went out, and although anybody who knows Farsi, and I've seen this in many different sources with every word laid out in its English translation, there is no word for wipe off the map in Farsi. Right?
The Middle East scholar Juan Cole has also affirmed this. He has said that there is no idiom for just that phrase.
Wait.
Well, I said it too.
You speak Farsi, yes?
Yes.
Would it be possible to have, you read Farsi, I assume, as well. Would it be possible to actually pull up this text in Farsi and have you translate it?
Sure.
Okay, at some point later in the evening. Great.
Because it really hurt. And now you might say, because I did, okay, look, if it's a mistranslation, why doesn't Ahmadinejad just come out and say it? And it's taken me a little while to figure out why he and some other government officials don't seem to take the charge of anti-Semitism as seriously as we might think they do. And it's a little more understandable when you're in Iran, because the defense of Israel is usually tied to the Holocaust. Israel is a country that was created so Jews would never have to again experience the Holocaust. When you're in Iran, you're in a different part of the world, and you realize, there were many Holocausts. First of all, there was the transatlantic slave trade. which took 100 million lives, and probably depopulated Africa to the tune of another 100 million. When they started, there was 100 million people in Africa and 100 million people in Europe, and 200 years later, there were 200 million in Europe and 100 million in Africa. I call it a Holocaust. But in our country, we talk to think of one Holocaust. And of course, it wasn't 6 million Jews. It was 6 million Jews and 4 or 5 million other people. Romans, the disabled, leftists, communists, trade unionists, lesbians, and gays. And so you can see even like, you wonder why someone who's supposed to be humanitarian would ignore the deaths of 4 or 5 million people in order to concentrate on one group of 6 million, call that the Holocaust and ignore everything else, because it was a political reason for doing that. I mean, I think it's a very serious issue. I'm pretty sure that, and then we're going to have a discussion, but which in this was the absolute airtight case that Iran is now trying to develop nuclear weapons. Now we're moving on to the charge of anti-Semitism. So anyway, I would wish that President Ahmadinejad were a little, I'm not even going to say sensitive, but that he understood a little bit more about how some of the things he says come across in this country. When you say, if there was a Holocaust, then we have to ask, what has that got to do with the Palestinians? I raised this with Ambassador Mohammad Karzai, the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. And he was shocked. And I didn't know why, because he obviously has heard this charge before. He said, no, you don't understand. The word if doesn't mean the same thing in Farsi as it does in the United States. It doesn't mean casting doubt on the fact that something could happen. Well, I hope you agree with me. Yes. It means, well, yeah, if that happened, then what has that got to do with this?
It's a logical construction.
It's not a denial that it happened, but in English, if I robbed your house this morning, would I come here tonight to talk about Iran? That makes it sound like I didn't rob your house this morning. You didn't get robbed today. So, but it's a language thing. The thing about Israel being wiped off the map, that was in his translation. But why didn't Ahmadinejad jump up? Because Israel is an aggressive, hostile, racist, settler state that is a threat to the Arab people. It was set up to be a threat to the Arab people. It was allowed to develop by the West because it was the equivalent of a military base in an area of the world that the U.S. has designs on and had no firm allies on. It's never been a safe haven for Jewish people. And this is not a light thing to me. My father's father grew up in a little village called Lidowiecki outside of Vilnius in Poland, which does not exist today. It's gone, along with 300 other villages that were wiped out by the Nazis in the non-concentration camp part of the Holocaust. But that atrocity was committed by Europeans against European Jews in Europe. So why do the Palestinians have to lose their historic homeland? Why are they forced out of their homes, their farmland, their territory, and made to live either as second-class citizens within Israel or in refugee camps, or in what amounts to open-air concentration camps in Gaza? How is that justified? And if that's all you heard all your life, after a while you might be tired of hearing about the Holocaust as a justification for the oppression of the Palestinians. And it's another example of how Israel has been a death trap for Jewish people, not only physically, but in increasing anti-Semitism in the world. It's not the only atrocity that ever happened. It's not the worst atrocity that ever happened. It's a terrible atrocity that should never be forgotten, but it does a tremendous disservice to those who died in the Holocaust to use their deaths to justify the oppression of another people. And I think that that's why, when Ahmadinejad speaks out against Israel, and the U.S. gets all hot and bothered, you know, but the rest of the world says, hey, yeah, you know, Ahmadinejad doesn't pay any price. He pisses off the U.S. When most countries, you know, don't have a very good opinion of anyone. It's a hard question, and I think that, you know, through our relationship with the Iranian government, which has been developing over the years, we've been able to raise the issue and get an audience, you know, how it's seen in the West. Also, on the issue of the Holocaust, Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez from Democracy Now! Interviewed Ahmadinejad, and there's a tape of the interview, and they asked him straight out, you know, do you deny the Holocaust? And he said, you know, obviously millions of people, millions of Jews were killed in World War II, and that was a great tragedy. But what has that got to do with the Palestinians? So he doesn't deny the Holocaust. But and don't forget, it was President Roosevelt who turned back boatloads of Jewish refugees and forced them, you know, to go back to Germany during the time of the Holocaust, while there were Jews who were, you know, found refuge in Iran. Not so much by the government. The government there was sympathetic to the Nazis. That was Reza Shah. The British kicked him out and brought in his son, who was more amenable to the Allied aims in the war. So we've got the charge that Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons, the charge that Iran wants to destroy Israel, the charge that Iran denies the Holocaust. What about the charge that the Iranian government is basically crazy? That is run by people who are motivated not by any rational sense of self-interest, but just a tremendous hatred for the rest of the world, and a belief that, you know, like the evangelical Christians believe, that you know, the Messiah will return one day and institute a world of peace and justice, and that we're preceded by an Armageddon, and so who cares if there's, you know, great turmoil going on. Well, it's a funny government that is both crazy and bent on world destruction, that has put so much resources into building up its infrastructure, its educational system, its healthcare system, bettering the lives of its people. As I said earlier, there's an Iranian-American professor at Virginia Tech who did a study in 2005 for the World Bank, in which he shows using information about the country's economy, that poverty in the country was decreased by 2005 to 1/8 of what it was under the Shah, and that the gap between the very poor and the middle class had actually shrunk, showing that the benefits primarily went to the poorest people. Before the Iranian Revolution, first of all, there wasn't even a census done in the country until the 50s. There were whole rural areas, and at the time of the Revolution, half the people lived in rural areas. They had no electricity. Now that seems like, okay, so they had no electricity. Well, they had no refrigerators. That means you can't keep food. You know, that means women who did most of the domestic work had to spend most of their time figuring out how to get food, cook it, keep it, feed it to the family before it went bad. Not to mention not being able to have a washer, or a dryer, or a television set to stay in touch with the world, or a radio, or a telephone. The revolution brought those things to the rural areas. And you know, in my book, there's statistics, which, you know, I don't use Iranian government statistics, but I don't use, you know, so-called progressive sources. I use the World Bank, the Library of Congress, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and so on. It shows that, you know, the level of electrification and how the rural poor and the urban poor both went through this incredible transformation. You know, in gaining the things that would free them up from the drudgery of work that had been done the same way for centuries. How about education? Under the Shah, about 18% of students were women at the university level. Today it's between 65 and 70%. How does that jive with the view that the government is run by male supremacists who hate women? The majority of doctors are women. Is it the majority? no, I'm sorry, it's 30%. 30%. That in the rural areas, there are health clinics that are run not by doctors and nurses, but by paramedics who have been taught how to recognize diseases and refer people to a regional clinic or a city hospital. And the emphasis is on preventative medicine, not on curing the drugs, but preventative medicine, similar to what they do in Cuba. Why? Because it's not a for-profit health system. You know, if you're not trying to make profits, you're trying to keep costs down. And the best way to keep costs down is keep people healthy. So, you know, women who before either couldn't get into universities or were not allowed by their parents, particularly their fathers, to go to the university because the universities were seen as areas where Western culture was adopted. And my daughter from a conservative background would be going to a university where women wear miniskirts and have parties and stuff. So I'm not going to let her go. And under the Shah, conservative religious people were discriminated against. Under Reza Shah, who was a brutal dictator and wanted to modernize the country quickly, he forbid the wearing of the hijab, which is as much a traditional cultural dress as it is a religious dress. And his soldiers would tear the hijab off of women in the streets. And even under his son, there were certain jobs women couldn't get. They weren't allowed into certain fancy restaurants and so on. And he promoted, a Western culture that a lot of people saw not only as immoral, but as a symbol of the government's submission to Western imperialism. It was humiliating culturally. And that's why after the revolution, the attitude changed. Personally, towards women's dress. Personally, I think that, if you are wearing a certain type of religious clothing for religious reasons, that should be a voluntary decision. Otherwise, how does it praise God if you're being forced to do it? On the other hand, and especially in the hot weather, but that's a very complicated issue that also has to do with centuries of culture. And not only the fact that men enforced a dress code on women. It was actually decided by a mass referendum that was pushed by conservative women after the revolution. As the establishment of the Islamic Revolution was established through a mass referendum approved by the majority of people, the vast majority of people. That's why it's an Islamic republic. All right, so they're not crazy. And there's a group there's an organization, an institute in D.C. called the U.S. Institute for Peace that was set up by Congress to try to educate diplomats and people in the State Department about the realities of other countries that they may have to deal with. And I have the 3 books they produced on the ground. One of them was written by John Lindbergh, who was one of the high-ranking officials of the U.S. Embassy when it was taken over by the revolutionary students in '79. So he was a hostage for 444 days. He also happens to be someone who understands Iranian culture. He lived and taught in the country for many years. He married an Iranian woman. He speaks Farsi. He knows the history and the culture, which he appreciates. And his book, called Negotiating with Iran, starts off by saying, now, if you're going to negotiate with Iran, you have to get past this view that the Iranians are crazy, unstable, fanatics that can't be dealt with rationally. That's the popular image, but that's not true. What he does say is that Iranians tend to think more in terms of history. If you're talking about this incident that happened yesterday, they'll bring up something that happened 500 years ago and feel that it's just as relevant. Well, their countries, their civilization's 5,000 years old. Ours is 400 or close. And also, they tend to put the concept of justice above the dictates of international law. Shia Islam particularly, which represents 10 to 13% of Muslims, or is embraced by 10 to 13% of Muslims, strongly emphasizes the issue of justice for the oppressed. And so the idea that Iran is being treated badly by the West is a moral issue to the Iranian government. And it's hard sometimes for the West to understand that. They think Iran's not acting in its own self-interest. They give it a deal which is going to materially benefit it. They offer a deal. Iran rejects it because it implies that they're accepting the U.S. version of the injustice that happened. And there were many. There were many. Iran was one of the first countries in the Middle East, and it's actually in South Asia, but in that region, to develop a movement for democracy. The constitutional revolution of 1905 to 11, I think were the years, where Iranians tried to develop a constitution, to go from a monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, where people had rights, where there was a parliament. And it was crushed by the Shah with the support of the British and the Russians. The next major attempt was in the 50s when Prime Minister Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a nationalist leader, member of parliament, an attorney, was elected prime minister and went on to nationalize Iranian oil, which had been owned since 1905 by the British. And he wanted more information about how much profits were being made, and he wanted Iranians to be trained as technicians, and he wanted finally a 50-50 split on the profits, which is what the U.S. offered Saudi Arabia. And when the British responded by just sending battleships to the Persian Gulf, he nationalized the industry. And it was the first oil nationalization by a country in the world. It was tremendously popular. He wound up as the man of the year on Time magazine. Not because he was popular in this country, but just because he was a big thing. And the CIA overthrew him. The Office of Special Services transformed into the CIA. Its first overthrow of the foreign government was in 1953, when Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, set up shop in Tehran, and with lots of money, bought off street mobs and some corrupt clerical figures and newspaper editors and thugs, and created turmoil in the streets that eventually overthrew Mossadegh. He was sent into house of exile. I think he did 3 years in prison, house of exile. And the Shah came back and was put back on the peacock throne. And so for the next 53 to 79, 26 years, the country was ruled by an increasingly autocratic and dictatorial figure, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who increasingly relied on the Savak secret police and torture to maintain his rule, and finally was overthrown in 1979.
But he served in Washington's interests.
Yeah, he was our buddy. He was the best friend of Washington next to Israel, and a close friend of Israel. And he got overthrown. It wasn't a bloodless revolution, but it was as close as the world had seen, where the motive force, the main force overthrowing the Shah, was millions and millions of people coming into the streets all over the country, marching against the soldiers, against the police. So many of them were shot down that people started dressing themselves in funeral shrouds and taking the front of the march, women as well as men, to show that we are not afraid to die. And there was also some defections in the military. There was a very important strike by oil workers, key industry of the economy, and there were Marxist organizations that carried on a certain level of guerrilla warfare. And it all combined to overthrow the Shah. And the most popular figure to emerge was the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had been exiled by the Shah in '63, I think it was, for writing an article criticizing the Shah for agreeing to something called the Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA. And under this, South Korea, U.S. citizens, military or not, cannot be arrested for crimes, could not be arrested for crimes in Iran. They were above the law. And Khomeini pointed out that this means that if a cook at the American embassy runs over the Shah, he's immune. But if the Shah runs over the cook's dog, he goes to jail. So the Shah kicked him out of the country. kind of embarrassing for him. And from Iraq and then France, and then he kept pounding away at the regime. And when others compromised, he refused to. And he emerged as the theoretical leader and, to some extent, an organizational leader of a large section of the revolution. 1 year after the revolution, Saddam Hussein figured this would be a real good time to attack Iran. The government was overthrown. The military was still there, but it was being purged. There was a whole transition going on, setting up alternate revolutionary organizations to replace the Shah's government, and the country was in trouble. And Saddam attacked thinking that he'd be able to overthrow the country. And he was wrong. And the war went on for 8 years, and each side lost about 600,000 people, and it ended about where it started. But the people rallied behind the government. Virtually every country supported Iraq. Iran stood virtually alone. Now the U.S. gave intelligence and military weapons to Saddam until it looked like he might get the upper hand, and then they started giving them to Iran. Because as Kissinger said, Secretary of State, it's too bad they both can't beat themselves to death. So it was a way of weakening two regional powers in the Middle East. So this is what Iran remembers. It remembers the 1953 coup against Mossadegh. It remembers the role that the U.S. played in the Iran-Iraq war. It remembers the fact that in 1988, the year before the war ended, the USS Vincennes, an Aegis-class high-tech destroyer, shot down an Iranian civilian airplane, Airbus 655, killing nearly 300 women, men, and children, claiming they thought it was a military plane, even though it doesn't look anything like a military plane. It was moving up and away from the ship at the time, and the U.S. tried to contact it by radio only on military frequencies. So we didn't know it was being contacted by the sense. The U.S. says it was an accident, Iran says it was on purpose. Nobody was prosecuted. They never apologized. President H.W. Bush said, "I will never apologize to the United States, no matter what." And they gave the captain and the top officers medals for their service. Not for shooting out a plane, but for service. Although that got a little garbled in collective understanding of Iran. It's a very bitter issue. In 2008, we had a program here, the Defenders, commemorating that event, and Iran sent a film crew, and it's part of a movie now in Iran. Apparently we were the only program to mark the 20th anniversary of the shooting down in the plane and apologizing for the U.S. war. So they remember. Here all we know about is the hostage situation. You know, students took over the embassy and held it for 444 days. That's all. And it was a spy operation, spying on the Soviet Union. And it was the embassy where the coup against Mossadegh was organized out of. And Jimmy Carter did talk to a set of Pentagon generals to the embassy during the revolution to see if there was a possibility of repeating 1953. So they have a much different view of the hostage situation than we do. So where does all that leave us? It leaves us with enough time to have a discussion, but stop talking. The charges against Iran are bogus. It's not trying to develop nuclear weapons. It hasn't attacked another country in over 200 years. It doesn't want to destroy Israel. It's not anti-Semitic. It's not run by a bunch of crazy people. It's a country that has its own contradictions and its own problems, and is trying to work it out, and could do that. There's no people in the world who are more political and more willing to change their country than Iran is. If the U.S. stays out of its business, leaves it alone. If it doesn't, we're going to war again. And the negotiations that are taking place now between the so-called group of 5+1, the five members of the UN Security Council, the one is Germany, who gets to tag along because, it's Germany. And they negotiate with Iran, who negotiates by itself. over the issue of nuclear power. And the U.S. position is stop enriching uranium or you get more sanctions. Not stop enriching uranium and we'll drop the sanctions, but stop enriching uranium or you'll get more sanctions. They're not offering anything to Iran. And Iran was willing to discuss dropping the 20% enrichment, but the U.S. just blew it off. So after the elections is over, I think what we're going to see is another, the threat of a physical confrontation.
You mentioned the sanctions. Are we asking them to stop all nuclear, like even legitimate nuclear accession for nuclear power plants? Are we just telling them absolutely nothing can be done nuclear-wise?
The U.S. seems to take a little different position at different times, depending on who's speaking, which is what they say about the Iranians. But yes, they want Iran to stop enriching uranium.
So how come like other countries?
Although they agree that they have the right to do that.
Well, how come other countries are able to do so freely? Like European countries are able to do so freely without having these type of sanctions put on them. What is the argument that America's saying for why they immediately accused Iran of?
They say that Iran is using that enrichment as a cover for actually developing nuclear weapons.
And if they were doing it for nuclear weapons, what argument is the U.S. making for saying why they can't have them when we have the biggest stockpile in the world?
What, you think Iran should have them just because we have them?
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying.
Kind of American are you?
But I mean,
we have a lot of things nobody else can have.
Well, still,
Clean water.
How come? Like, what kind of argument is being made for us?
They're saying that Iran is trying to develop a nuclear weapon. If they had it, it would use it, and that's too dangerous. And they refined their position recently. Leon Panetta, head of the Defense Department, admitted, was it 6 months ago, Iran is not trying to develop a nuclear weapon. But they're developing the capability to develop a nuclear weapon. And that's what we have to stop, because at some point they may decide to develop a nuclear weapon, and they'll have everything in place. So that's the refined argument.
So the only country in the world that's actually used a nuclear weapon against another country is the one saying we can't
No,
develop.
they don't.
One way to do it.
That's a stupid question.
I have no stupid question. I have stupid answers.
I don't know much about nuclear power. Imagine developing nuclear power and nuclear weapons. You have the same, research up to a point. Developing uranium for your nuclear core or nuclear weapons. But at what point does it diverge to where? Does Iran got to the point where they've done what they need for nuclear power? Are you going beyond that to where it's going to be nuclear weapons, or is it still?
Yeah, this